Well, time to talk to the Defence Minister for hopefully some answers. And to take us there, here is the Russian President speaking overnight about the sanctions imposed by the West against his country.
By the way, these sanctions that are being imposed, they are akin to declaring war. But thank God we haven't got there yet. I think our so-called quote-unquote partners still have an understanding of what the ramifications and threats to everybody could be.
Peter Dutton, welcome to the program.
Thanks, David.
Are these sanctions, as President Putin suggests, akin to an act of war?
Well, it's very hard to get inside President Putin's mind to understand the rationale of what he's doing now, let alone what his next steps will be. But I think, as Raf pointed out before, there is a great unification within Europe, a great horror by Europe and the rest of the world as to what is happening, the slaughter of people and the conduct of what we know through history to be a brutal force of the Russians, and the way in which they will step that up over coming weeks is of concern to everyone. And if it escalated beyond that into this threat of a nuclear response, then that would be catastrophic, clearly. So everything at the moment is designed to try and continue the pressure on Vladimir Putin, those around him, those who have been the financial beneficiaries of the corruption within Russia, and hopefully, ultimately, they can turn back, but there's clearly no sign of that.
Well, there's not, certainly not in the south of Ukraine. The Ukrainian president has again pleaded for a no-fly zone over his country. Would that help?
Well, it would definitely help if it didn't lead to a nuclear conflict, and that's clearly what everybody within NATO, the United States, every peace-loving country around the world would seek. I mean, nobody in their right mind wants a nuclear war with anybody, not a conflict of any nature with anybody. So the difficulty here is if you provide more support and surge with troops, and this is NATO's dilemma, or you allow planes to be staged out of Poland or somewhere else, what is the next step, and what is Putin's next play? And he's holding out, in sort of slightly veiled language, the threat of stepping up or nuclear conflict, and that, as I say, would be clearly catastrophic for Europe and the world.
So nuclear deterrence in this case works?
Well, I think there are always lessons in history, and nobody wants a repeat of the 1930s, and we've been very clear about the concerns that we have in our own region, in the Indo-Pacific. But there will be, and already there are people with 20/20 hindsight about what the status of the Ukraine should have been, whether it should have been admitted into NATO, whether it should have been embraced by the EU, whether there should have been a greater provision of supplies and weapons to the Ukraine to provide that deterrence.
Is that your view?
But look, in the end, well, I think in the end, what is very clear to us is that President Putin has a view of erasing history and of conquering those countries around him and bringing back a reunified USSR. That's very clearly his intent. That's the view out of the Ukraine, the view out of the intelligence analysts, and that's what concerns NATO and the world as well. Does it stop at the Ukraine, or does it provide them with a greater foothold in Europe and a launching pad then into another country? And we need to be very clear about his intention, his capability. I think he's been significantly wounded out of this, both domestically and in terms of the international reputation that people have of Russia. And I think there will be internal discussions about the viability of his leadership going forward. But that's all to play out, and people have got 20/20 hindsight. What we now need to do is project forward as to what
let's talk about what's happening now. Can you clear up for us what lethal military support Australia is providing, and has any arrived there yet?
It has arrived, David. So we've worked with our partners, in particular the UK and the US, and we've provided that support. The President has spoken to our Prime Minister, and that's, I think, been a productive discussion,
so
and it's been a productive activity for us. Well, I'm not going into that, and I'm not going into where it's arrived into or how we've got it into the hands of the Ukrainians. Right. And there's more assistance that we want to provide.
Well, the Prime Minister did say we're talking. He said we're talking missiles, we're talking ammunition. Is Australia providing missiles and ammunition?
We've been clear about that, and yes, that's the case. We want the Ukrainians to have the best opportunity to defend their homeland and to protect women and children, particularly in those residential areas where we've seen shelling and the obvious human cost of that, which is horrific.
Is the aim of supplying weapons to Ukraine to stop Russia, just slow it down? And, you know, to that end, how far is Australia prepared to go here with our allies to achieve this sort of aim?
Well, the aim is to defeat the Russian forces and have them turn back and go back to their own country and allow peace to return and the rebuild to commence and people to be repatriated back to the country that they love in the Ukraine.
So you'll keep arming Ukraine until that's achieved, that objective's achieved?
Well, we'll make those assessments as this situation unfolds, but our desire is to see the Ukrainians exact a very significant cost on the Russians, both in terms of their reputation and their so-called military might. They have been stifled and the Ukrainians have put up a magnificent resistance so far, but there is a sense of inevitability when you look at the strength and the sheer numbers, and also the propensity for Putin to use chemical weapons or other weapons which would be used in a residential area that would have
Yeah, okay. Just to be clear on this,
that we just couldn't imagine, David,
Australia
which would be a war crime, I might point out, which is another ingredient in all of this as well.
Australia will keep arming Ukraine until Russia is pushed back out of the country.
We'll continue to provide support when we think it's in the Ukraine's best interest and in our national interest to be involved in that. So that's a discussion with the Ukrainians and also with our allies, and in particular the United Kingdom.
What are the lessons for China from all of this?
From my perspective, David, I think it's important for us to continue to talk up about the fact that China is amassing nuclear weapons. They are militarising ports. There are now 20 points of military presence in the South China Sea. The Japanese, to whom you referred earlier in the earlier discussion, do see a situation where China goes into Taiwan as an existential threat to the Japanese. The Indians are obviously concerned about their land border with China. So I think transparency, and I think us shining a light on the reality and not pretending that it's something different in the Indo-Pacific is the way in which we can bring world pressure to bear to say to China, look, we want a normalised relationship. We want to trade with you. We have an unbelievably successful expat community here in Australia, wonderful Chinese Australians who have contributed to our country. And we don't want conflict. We want to deter those ambitions, and we want peace to prevail in Taiwan as much as we do it to prevail in the Ukraine.
Well, the Prime Minister told 6PR on Friday there's, quote, a very clear understanding of what the implications would be if China were to seek to realise its ambitions for Taiwan. Is it very clear?
Well, it's very clear in terms of what that would mean for Taiwan. There's a much greater nationalistic sentiment in Taiwan than there was, say, in Hong Kong. I mean, we're not talking anymore about young protesters who were incarcerated in Hong Kong, the martial law that's applying in Hong Kong, and the complete
Minister, what would the implications be
process
for China? What would the implications be for China? The Prime Minister says they would be very clear.
I think you're seeing the reputational risk that's being incurred by Russia at the moment, and President Xi would have to question whether or not he would want that similar response from what has really been an action that
so
has
just
united
reputational risk,
the response around
or would
the world.
we see sanctions? Would Australia arm Taiwan in the way we're arming Ukraine?
Well, I think we do whatever we can to deter China from acts of aggression in our region, David. Let's be very honest. And the question is, as it is in the Ukraine at the moment, if it's Taiwan, does it just stop there? Does it mean that that China wants to have, this tributary state model, as Kissinger and others have spoken about over history in the Indo-Pacific? What does it mean for our trading relationships with Malaysia or with Vietnam or with Indonesia? What does it mean? Does it just stop within Taiwan? So there is a cost for action, and there is, as we've always seen during the course of history, a cost of inaction. And so ours, for now, is a desire to see peace prevail and to deter any acts of aggression, whether it's from China or from Russia or anybody else. But this unholy alliance
just coming back
that's
to that
formed
question,
between China and Russia, I think, is really concerning to every observer.
This cost that you talk about, the very clear implications the Prime Minister's referred to, would we arm Taiwan, or would we join military action over Taiwan?
Well, David, we would take interest in any of those conflicts or the threat of conflict that serve our national interest. Our job is to keep Australians safe, and that's why we've entered into the AUKUS arrangement to acquire the nuclear sub-capability. It allows potentially a vertical launch system or some use of missiles, which would speak to a very strong deterrence message. And that's what we would do. I mean, for the first time, as we've said, since the Second World War, we are looking at ways in which we can defend our homeland. Now, that was inconceivable talk even 5 years ago, but what we're seeing in the world at the moment is a reality. And it's no sense in pretending that it's not happening, that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by China is not happening. It is happening. And
so I'm just trying to get you clear about
amassing huge forces.
You said in November, Minister, that it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't support the US in an action over Taiwan. Is that still your view?
Well, David, if it's in our national interest to protect our homeland and our allies, then we would take that decision at that time as to what was in our country's best interests. And there's no sense pretending otherwise. We live in a very uncertain time, and not just the next few years, but the next couple of decades. We want peace to prevail in our region, but you don't have that peace if you're arguing from a position of weakness. Australia needs to be in a strong position. We're in the strongest possible position if we're in the company of great allies like NATO partners, like those within the AUKUS construct, the Five Eyes, and others, very important relationships that we have with Indo-Pacific partners as well.
Let's look at that strong position, as you put it, that Australia's defence is in. What are the lessons from what's happening in terms of Australia's defence? Germany, we've seen, has decided to dramatically increase its defence budget. Are you now going to look more urgently to address the gaps in Australia's defence?
Well, clearly, David, we've ramped up off a very low base from when Labor was last in government, the spending in defence across the three services. Not just in our people, but the acquisition of assets as well. I made mention of the AUKUS submarine deal, but that also has a very significant investment into space, which is a new frontier. We have a significant investment already, but I think more required into cyber defences. Regardless of what happens in Taiwan, Australia will be the subject of cyber attacks, as we are this very day, from China, Iran, North Korea, Russia and many other countries, and organised criminal syndicates that work in concert with those countries. So we'll continue to invest in those platforms, missiles, the guided weapons enterprise that we're working up at the moment as well.
But on the nuclear submarines, we still don't know which submarine we're going to buy, what it's going to cost, where it's going to be built, who might build them. We're told the first will hopefully be ready by 2040. Should Australia, as an interim measure, be building new Collins-class submarines to ensure we don't have a capability gap?
Well, a couple of points here, David. I mean, firstly, we are going to acquire the capability much sooner than that. And
when?
The arrangement that's underway at the moment between the US and the UK and us has been incredibly productive. We'll have an announcement within the next couple of months about which boat we're going with, what we can do in the interim, and both the US and the UK understand the timelines, they understand what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, and they are very, very willing partners. So
we don't need an interim submarine in your view?
The condensing of that timeline. Well, the second point is this Collins class was designed in the 1980s. We would have to start from scratch. It would mean that we're running 3 platforms. So it's complete folly that we would go into a new build, an immature design, a design that was first constructed in the 1980s. It's not feasible. I've looked very closely at it, but it's not something that we're going to do.
And on the frigates, it's a $45 billion contract. You've already agreed to push back the start date of construction till 2024. There are still concerns about the design, whether the ships are going to be too heavy and slow. Defence can't even say what the top speed of these boats will be. Are you going to stick with this contract or scrap it and find a better solution?
We're going to stick with the contract, and I think many of the issues that you've raised have already been addressed or in the process of being addressed. In our country, frankly, I think over decades under both Liberal and Labor governments, we've had too great a propensity to want to bespoke it and to make it to Australianise, if you like to use that term. Where that's necessary, we'll do that, particularly in relation to weapon systems where we want compatibility with the United States and our allies, but otherwise I want to acquire capability much more quickly than we have in the past. Right. We've been able to do that in relation to helicopters recently, for example, but there's a lot more that we need to acquire and more quickly because of the threat that we face over the coming decade and beyond.
On the floods, it's affected your electorate. We can see the creek behind you there that obviously was one of those flooded. Towns in northern New South Wales like Lismore, Ballina, Corrockey were cut off for days. Some are still sleeping in cars. They have struggled to get basic supplies. The New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet conceded there should have been better coordination on the ground. As Defence Minister, do you accept that locals, some of them, have been let down?
Well, first point, I think, David, is that it's much more than a flood that we're experiencing in northern New South Wales and the surrounding remote towns in particular, but Lismore and Grafton Coffs all the way through. It's much more akin to a cyclone that's gone through there. There is absolute devastation in some of the communities. The initial response, of course, is from the councils, from the SES, from the state government emergency people, and then Defence comes in. And we've come in force, and we will increase the numbers dramatically. We've got about just over 2,000 people in operational duties at the moment. We're bringing in heavy machinery. They're helping Telstra restore communications, helping the energy companies restore power to areas where it's inaccessible for them otherwise. They've performed now 113 people have been rescued with our fixed wing, with our helicopters.
Were you satisfied, though, Minister, with the Defence response?
I'm absolutely satisfied with the Defence response and the bravery exercised by these people. The work that they're doing on the ground is quite phenomenal, David, and I won't tolerate one piece of criticism of the ADF from what I've seen. We're surging that to 5,000 over the next few days, and that will be supplemented by more if we need to do it. There's never been a question of the numbers of people that we need on the ground. I've made it very clear to the Chief of the Defence Force that we will do whatever it takes to help these people get back on their feet as quickly as possible. There is already, in many of the townships that you've mentioned, people that have been rescued, food that's been dropped. Will continue the drop of fuel, the drop of water, the provision of housing, the entry of where it's possible to get in by road, or we will carve new roads in there. The Defence Force is out in full might, and you'll see it continue to ramp up. And as we've seen in Gympie, in Brisbane, the clean-up, the reconstruction, they'll be involved in all of that as well.
Defence Minister Peter Dutton, we have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.